All right. So welcome everyone to the Angel Island Immigration Station. Today is May 6th, and today is 140 years since the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which represented the first time in our nation's history where a country's laborers were forbidden from coming to the U.S. and where its citizens were forbidden from becoming U.S. citizens. We know that the Chinese Exclusion Act was just the first of many exclusionary immigration policies and laws. It was followed in subsequent decades by additional laws that essentially created an Asian Pacific barred zone, where if you were from an Asian Pacific Islander country, you weren't allowed to become a U.S. citizen. And so while that law was repealed many years ago, the impacts of the Chinese Exclusion Act are still faced today as we see the racism and xenophobia that led to the Chinese Immigration Act of 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, is now repeated in the violence and attacks that we see against our communities. May also happens to be Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, as well as Jewish American Heritage Month. And it's so important for all of our communities to recognize these histories, to understand these histories, and to lean into a curiosity and learning about these histories. And so today we will be placing these candles to finish the Lighting the Darkness exhibit inside the former detention barracks. Each of the 140 candles represents a year since the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act and a year of continuing impact on Chinese families, on Asian and Pacific Islander families, on many other families. And it's a reminder for us to hope for a better future.
Angel Island State Park is an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay that holds so much history. Here at the U.S. Immigration Station, hundreds of thousands of people took their first steps in the United States, but not all were successful in coming into the country. Some were sent back to the countries they had come from. And the largest group impacted by this facility is the Chinese community. The Chinese exclusion laws that started in 1882 and were part of the law of the land of the United States until 1943 had a huge impact on Chinese immigration, but also the Chinese communities that were here in the United States. People had to take on false identities to get around these racist laws. They were separated from family here at this facility, and sometimes for years, because their family members were not allowed to immigrate to the United States. Sometimes they never saw their families again. And we want to make sure that we remember 140 years since this law was passed, but also the impact that it continues to have on communities today. I want to thank you all for coming to this ceremony to commemorate 140 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. It's my real great honor to be here today, both joining my past experience here with the Immigration Station Foundation and the efforts to preserve it, and my current role as California's Deputy Secretary for Access, working to create more equitable access to our parks and open spaces and our cultural and historic places. I was reflecting that this year, 2022, marks 25 years since I first became involved with the Immigration Station Foundation, and this project and this work remains one I think will forever be among my proudest accomplishments to have worked alongside California State Parks to bring the story of Chinese exclusion to light. And that is, I think about how I grew up not 30 miles from here in San Mateo County, and I actually never knew the history of this place or that Angel Island Immigration Station even existed. Despite the fact that my mother's family was detained here, and on my father's side, our family has over 1,000 pages of documents in the Chinese exclusion files in the National Archives. That I didn't know the history was perhaps not unusual because Chinese exclusion as a history had been nearly erased. In our own community, I think perhaps a story of shame and secrecy, and perhaps, I think in our community, folks who experienced that may have thought, how could this have happened to me in a country like America, a country that was supposed to be welcoming to immigrants, that has this ideology of ourselves as an immigrant nation? And for the dominant culture, perhaps that history was inconsequential, not a story worth telling, and not a history worth sharing. But, exclusion has a way of casting a very long shadow. What does it mean when your country tells you that you don't belong? What does it mean when you have to prove that you have a right to be here? And what is the legacy of what that does to our voice as people, as communities? The shadow of exclusion is very long, and we witness it still today in the increased anti-Asian violence, which continues to cast Asians as others in this country. Just last summer, my stepdaughter and I were the targets of anti-Asian violence on the streets of San Francisco. In the aftermath of those incidents, my emotions ran from fear to anger to frustration. And I thought too of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents, and how heartbroken they would have been to have thought that 140 years after we came to America, that their family could still be so othered in this country. And that's why I'm really proud to work with California State Parks and the Foundation and the work that has been done here at Angel Island to tell the story of Chinese exclusion. Designating this site as a National Historic Landmark and preserving the immigration station has meant that this history, the history of Chinese exclusion, will be told from now into the future. There's no putting that back in the bottle. So from here, we learn about our past, and we're able to ask ourselves the questions that have really plagued this nation since our beginning. Who is included, and who is excluded, and why? Those stories, whose stories do we tell? Whose stories have been erased? And our history isn't always pretty, but there are consequences for ignoring it. As a part of the California State Parks Reexamining Our Past initiative, the state is currently taking stock of and critically reexamining its past. Working with community partners and universities is really essential into getting the story right. It's how we can then take that history with contemporary research methodology, working with community partners, and make sure that the exhibits here are inclusive and relevant. And as a result, we're making progress toward healing relationships with California Native Americans and communities whose places and histories have been ignored and even erased. In September of last year, the California State Park and Recreation Commission voted to rename Patrick's Point State Park to Sume State Park to honor the place name that was used by the Yurok people since time immemorial. And at Folsom Lake State Recreation Area, State Parks continues to be engaging with stakeholders for a name change at the Negro Bar State Day Use Area. And at Sutter's Fort, State Parks is gathering public input on a proposal that will fundamentally change the way that history there is interpreted so that it will be more inclusive and accurate. And of course, the work here at Angel Island to bring forward the history of Chinese exclusion and its manifestation here at Angel Island Immigration Station has been exemplary in this way for quite a long time. In fact, since before the Reexamining Our Past initiative even began. Because Angel Island tells the story of Chinese exclusion, and it reminds us of what shouldn't have happened. It's a story that has now come out from behind the story of the curtain of secrecy and shame, and it's something that has allowed our community, my community of Asian Americans, and particularly Chinese Americans, to have reclaimed this and claimed that history as our own, to say that our history is also America's history. And so to everyone out there who has ever felt that they don't belong and wondered if you have a place here, I say your story is California's story, your story is America's story, and you belong. So thank you so much for joining us at this exhibit here today.
This is the Chinese immigrant monument that was originally donated by restaurateur Trader Vic Bergeron, and we have moved this monument here to this scenic outlook, and it represents the histories, the lives of those immigrants who have been impacted by so many different exclusionary immigration policies. As we lay this wreath today on the 140th anniversary since the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, we honor and remember the Chinese and other immigrants who were detained here at Angel Island Immigration Station and all immigrants who've been impacted by exclusionary immigration policies then and now. So with Casey Dexter Lee and Catherine Choi, it's my privilege to lay this wreath in memory of our ancestors. we can have a brief moment of silence in honor of our ancestors.